This is just a little bit of brag time because I've been trying to get these lights right here to work. I've got some other stuff because I want to make that wall. Come on, focus, focus, focus. Come on, buddy. I want to make that wall right there look like super cool. I've done the light YouTube-y thing before. So that whole light bulb project was really to see if I could get this nighttime shot in the office, and it's getting there. I kind of like it. All the books are up. If you haven't noticed, the gar hole has been cleaned up for the most part. The books are up. They're almost all organized. But anyway, if there's been any theme for the 30-day shred, it has been me understanding that the chronology of Scripture is telling so much of the story that we want to look at sometimes. And the reason I wanted to put together a big prophet video was to talk about that, because that's the thing that jumped out as I was reading Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel kind of all at the same time. And before we go into this, I kind of do need to put up a little bit of a precursor to this, and it's this. I spent a lot of time in Isaiah and Jeremiah this last year. I'm beginning what I have a feeling is going to be a multi-year process in Jeremiah. And then I went super, super deep into Isaiah and a chronological understanding of Hezekiah earlier this year. I actually preached a whole sermon series on, not a whole series, two weeks in a row of just this complicated relationship of Hezekiah's leadership and Isaiah. So I knew what I was getting into when I jumped into this, but I wanted to take the time to do some extra research over the weekend, and I wanted for us to think just real quick about the fact that Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel are almost all stacked on top of each other. Jeremiah and Ezekiel are stacked on top of each other. But if we put out this timeline, so the first part of this is the timeline of the three major prophets. I've got it here on my iPad, and you're seeing it on the screen right now. But Isaiah, for the most part, we look at him, we can date that because it says in the year that King Uzziah died. So we can start Isaiah's ministry really in that place. And we'll talk more about these whole kings dying thing in a little bit. But we see that he ministered through 5 different kings. We'll talk about that later. And then right about 50 years after he died is where we see Jeremiah come into play. And Jeremiah lives through 5 kings as well, has a super, super long ministry. And then like at the end of Jeremiah's life, for like 20 years, you have Ezekiel. But Ezekiel is prophesying from Babylon, so they're contemporaries, but not probably really in the same space. And you also have to think about what we know about exile and the fact that, Jeremiah, he had this role that was there. But we also know that Ezekiel was exiled, which meant that his family was important, that they were seen as part of just like this cultural breakdown that the Babylonians loved to do. They'd come, take over a country, and they would pull out all of the royalty, the ruling class, the artists, the smart people. They would pretty much just leave behind the folks who they didn't think were really strong enough or had the ability to cause any sort of resistance. And so there's some interplay, there's some narrative inside of Jeremiah, but Jeremiah was left behind. Ezekiel and his family wasn't. And that's the thing. All 3 of the major prophets, we think of the prophets and we want to read them and we get bored because it's kind of hard to read. But all the prophets also have these narrative sections in certain places. And what's interesting is, with Isaiah, the narrative section, a lot of it has to do with King Hezekiah. Jeremiah, you see his prophecy, but you also have these narrative sections of the back and forth of him with the leadership, and then what happens after the destruction of Jerusalem. And like Jeremiah ends in like a really, really weird piece. And then Ezekiel coming in, and and having this prophecy, having these narratives as well. And let's look at the king thing. Let's go into the king thing real quick. So now we've got another video laying on top talking about this king issue. So you see Isaiah is dealing with pretty much 5 kings. Jeremiah is dealing with 5 kings. There's a couple of kings of Israel while Ezekiel's there. But remember, he's in Babylon, so you've got all the whole Babylonian thing. And Isaiah starts off in the year that King Uzziah died. It's when he gets his call. We have to look at the fact that, think about the last year in America, how tumultuous the transition of power has been with the January 6 riots, all of that sort of thing. And you've got to realize that back then, whenever kings died, and you see, these guys had long lives, long ministries, but also these kings were killed off quick as well. That anytime that there was a transfer of power, stuff began to get just absolutely bonkers. And that helps us kind of go into their ministry a little bit later. And then there's a gap. There's a king between Isaiah and between Jeremiah. And what you also see is that Isaiah kind of ends his ministry with Hezekiah, who is a good king. And you have Manasseh, who is absolutely just horrible. And then we see King Josiah in Jeremiah's ministry, another good king, really and truly the last good king. And so just think about all these transitions of power. And the transitions of power leads really to the thing about what do we do with the prophets? Now, depending on your religious tradition, the idea of prophecy might mean really different things to you. But I think that if we want to take a healthy but accurate understanding of what the role of the prophet was in the Old Testament. And we have to think about the prophet prophesies. So when we think prophecy, very, very different. The prophets are not about like future telling. They're about truth telling. And if we look at their role inside of Israel, we look at the fact these were all influential people. They were priests. They had access to the courts. They had access to the temple. They had access to the people. When we begin reading the major prophets as truth tellers, it helps us reckon with some stuff, and it helps us understand some things. And so, that's the prophet video that I've been holding out, the conversation or whatever. Holding out's not the right word, but so much of what is important about it is I'm now leading into a couple of 3-day reading of all of the minor prophets. And I'm curious to see how that happens, because these folks are all scattered in this exact same timeline. Ezra and Nehemiah are also scattered in this timeline. The beginning of First Chronicles is scattered in this timeline. And so I got some flack early on in this video series from somebody who's saying, all your ideas of chronological readings and narrative readings make things too complicated. But I want to argue with that and say that these chronological narrative readings actually make the Bible so much more accessible. They make it so much more understandable because we're able to put it in the situation of what's going on. Because, we come at stuff so many times, turkey buzzers, and we just think that this is this tome that's full of stories that should be affecting our moral behavior. When in reality, what it is a story of our people across thousands of years who were enacting faithfulness to the living God up until the moment where that living God comes to this earth fully divine, fully human, here changes everything. And then we have the New Testament and Paul's letters and Peter's letters and Acts and John and the John community and John's writings, all these sorts of things. And they're talking about what faithfulness looks like in light of Jesus being here. But I also think that it's in light of the exile. And just this run of understanding the prophets is something that we need to begin to understand, because it sets the stage for Jesus and the showdown with the Pharisees and the Sadducees and John the Baptist and all of those sorts of things. That is a religious system that was created as a result of all the crazy town that we find here. So this has gone on a little bit longer than I would thought. Do me a favor, tell me what you think about this setup. I'm not going to use it all the time, but I like having a solid night shot if I'm filming videos at night. So I'm Chad, I'm a pastor here in Louisiana. I'm reading the Bible in 30 days, and y'all, we're almost done. So I will hang out with you in the comments. Let me know what you're thinking about. See you in the next video.